Ever since Dead by Daylight introduced their first licensed killer via the Halloween DLC, everybody's rushed to find out who the next licensed killer could be. It wasn't until the 4th year anniversary that opened the doors to a whole new genre of possibilities. The Silent Hill chapter opened the possibilities to other licensed video game killers coming into Dead by Daylight. After that, a couple of chapters later, we got Resident Evil. So that got me thinking, what other possible video game chapters could we possibly get in Dead by Daylight? I composed a list of video game horror characters that I will love to see in Dead by Daylight. With that being said, I am excluding games that came after a movie or a show like The Walking Dead or Slender the Arrival, and strictly focusing on horror video games. So before we get into the list, I want to start off with some honorable mentions. Just because they're on here doesn't mean that I don't want them in Dead by Daylight. Starting off with Five Nights at Freddy's. Hold up. Now the reason I didn't put them on the list is because it would probably have been my number one. I know that Five Nights at Freddy's has been the number one on mostly everybody's list, so by just giving it an honorable mention, I want to fill the list with a couple of different games. With that being said, Five Nights at Freddy's would be an amazing addition to the game, despite its very weird and sometimes controversial franchise. Another game I want to mention is Castlevania. Now, Castlevania could be considered one of the pioneers in the Metroidvania genre, and cemented Dracula as a classic video game villain. And the reason I'm just giving it an honorable mention, it's because if the leaks end up being true, that means we're going to be getting Castlevania for October. So I'm gonna keep it here just in case, instead of putting it in my top 10. And so, without further ado, let's begin with the list. Number 10. Alice Madness Returns. The sequel to American McGee's Alice, released all the way back in October 6th of the 2000s. The sequel, Alice Madness Returns, released in 2011, the game was a dark and twisted retelling of the classic fairy tale Alice in Wonderland. It stars Alice Little as she battles her inner demons while trying to remain sane in an asylum by transporting herself into Wonderland, which is a nightmarish hellscape of what once was a wonderful land. Dead by Daylight is no stranger to Alice in Wonderland, having a collection already. It's honestly what made me revisit this old game. It has a very unique hack and slash and platformer mechanic, combined with its very twisted and gory visuals, make this a very underrated gem. So for a chapter, they would obviously have Alice as the survivor, and for the map, a couple of the first levels of Wonderland that I really think encapsulate what really makes Alice Madness that eerie horror take on a fairy tale. And for the killers, there are various characters we can choose from, including the Hatter, the Red Queen, or the Mad Scientist. But my pick would be the Executioner. I think he embodies everything Alice represents, and is a driving force that hunts you down throughout the entire game. And I just think the design looks bloody amazing. Number 9. Outlast. Released back in 2013, Outlast made horror games scary again. With a field of view aesthetic and a first-person camera angle mixed together with the vulnerability and the horrifying visuals, really pushed the limit of what a survival horror could be. The game centers around the protagonist investigating an abandoned insane asylum where he has to navigate horrific enemies while uncovering the truth of what really happened here. You play as Miles, facing off against a plethora of demented enemies. We honestly have a lot of characters to choose from for killer. Richard Trigger is one of the most prolific enemies in the game. Chris Walker also being the face of the game, and what a handsome lad he is. But my vote would have to go to Eddie Glutskin, featured in the Whistleblower DLC. He's a very insane and intense antagonist that chases you down throughout the entire game, trying to force you to be his wife. He puts you through so many horrific and mind-boggling scenarios, and bringing him over to Dead by Daylight would just be downright terrifying to me. Now the reason I place Outlast so high up on my list is because unfortunately, you do play as a faceless protagonist. So either they would have to come up with an original unique face for the protagonist, or they would just not include him at all. Number 8. Danganronpa. So Danganronpa might look like the typical visual novel anime point-and-click dating game you would see your disgusting teenage brother play in the basement. But you can say the same thing about Doki Doki Literature Club, and that game is just straight up messed up, bro. Danganronpa is a visual point-and-click murder mystery, Saw-like inspired game, with a little bit of Death Note and Ace Attorney. Some of the detective work really makes you think before you have somebody executed. Now, the reason I think this game could work in Dead by Daylight is because it taps into a different type of horror. Not all horror is the typical slasher monster creeping in the corner. Sometimes, it's just the helplessness and despair that one can feel in a situation where you have no power over. Dead by Daylight celebrates all things horror, and I think it would be a great anime representation in the genre. Now, having this being a franchise and all, there are multiple characters which we can choose from. I feel like the best representation would be Makoto from the first game, Trigger Happy Havoc, and just the possibility of so many legendary skins for him. As for the map, we would have a couple of possibilities as well. The school, Hope's Peak High. As for the killer, I don't think a lot of people would appreciate a giant Monokuma chasing you around with a hammer. I mean, it's not like the Legion could just put on a mascot suit and chase you around, am I right? I think our best option would be Junko, giving you the type of crazed teenage obsessed schoolgirl, kind of like Susie, but with the predatory mindset of the pig. I'm just saying that if Identity V could get it to work, why not Dead by Daylight? Number 7. Clock Tower. Oh boy, another Japanese horror games, 2 in a row, baby. The original Clock Tower came out all the way back in 1995 in Japan for the original Famicom. Now raise your hand if you have no idea what a Famicom is. It was actually never released in the US, but there are English versions out there. The version we did get though, Clock Tower, is actually Clock Tower 2 in Japan, but we are getting a Clock Tower remake this year, hopefully. So with that out of the way, Clock Tower is a point-and-click adventure game that actually predates some of the best horror survivor games out there like Resident Evil and Silent Hill. Some would even call it the grandfather of survival horror. So in this game, you play as Jennifer Simpson, an orphan who got adopted into the wealthy family home that obviously was not haunted whatsoever, and soon finds herself at the mercy of the dreaded Scissor Man. Now look at this guy, what a dapper young man. So the game is pretty simple. You just click where you want to go, while at the same time being chased by the Scissor Man. Sound familiar? There have been a couple of games after the original, but I truly believe that they should adapt the first one into Dead by Daylight. The Scissor Man has always been an iconic staple in this franchise. The clock tower and the mansion will make for a spectacular map. It's honestly crazy how we haven't had a haunted mansion map yet in Dead by Daylight, and this would be a fantastic opportunity to bring one in. Hopefully now that the remake comes out, this game could get a little more attention and just a little bit of more love. Who wouldn't want to love this little guy? Number 6. Dying Light. The successor to the Dead Island franchise, Dying Light came out all the way back in 2015 and was a mix of survival horror with a first-person shooter parkour system that let the player traverse through an open-world zombie-infested nightmare. Having 2 mainline games in the franchise, I feel like including the first game's protagonist Kyle Crane would be a more diverse choice, with maybe having Aiden, the second game's protagonist, as a legendary skin. The game centers around you traversing a post-apocalyptic city, doing favors for criminal organizations, and trying to find caches scattered around the city. It's as basic as a zombie survival horror apocalypse games can get, my guy. As for the main killer, it wouldn't just be a regular zombie. Oh no. It would obviously be the Volatile. The backdrop of this zombie apocalypse is of course the rundown remains of a post-apocalyptic city. Something we have yet to see in Dead by Daylight. And no, RPD does not count. That is a police station. The Volatile are a special type of zombie that will practically match your speed and strength, and if you're not careful, will just outright destroy you. In Dying Light, the Volatile will hunt you down, sometimes in packs, making you regret ever stepping outside at night. With its terrifying screeching and leaping capabilities, it makes this zombie just a little bit more special. There are over 1,000 possibilities for a zombie game representation in Dead by Daylight, with one of the best ones, Left 4 Dead, already included. So I feel like Dying Light would be a perfect inclusion. Number 5. Amnesia. Y'all remember when this game took over YouTube back in the early 2010s? Not one streamer missed out on playing this game back in the day. And that's kind of how it rose to popularity. Amnesia came back all the way back in 2010, and it was a survival horror game where you were able to solve a couple of puzzles by steering clear of monsters while also watching your insanity meter go down, or keeping it afloat. In the game, you play as Daniel, and he wakes up in a castle with, you guessed it, amnesia. And with no memory of who he is, what he's doing, or if he turned on the stove or not, you wander around the castle while avoiding these horrendous creatures that just want to get a good look at you. And while Alexander Brandenburg is the main antagonist of Amnesia, I feel like the Gatherers pose a more impending threat throughout the entire game. There have already been a couple of sequels, and the last one being Amnesia Rebirth, but the full chapter dedicated to what started it all would be ideal. With such an impactful part of the internet culture, I feel like it would be a great representation in Dead by Daylight. There are already a couple of content creators who have brought this idea to life. This video right here comes to mind. Really check it out, it's amazing. They really highlight how well a chapter like this could work. Number 4. Dead Space. Made with the love and passion and dedication to bring Resident Evil 4 into space. Released all the way back in 2008, this game became one of the scariest games of the decade, competing for the rival ring of some of the best survival horror in the genre. After the success, it spawned 2 sequels, a couple of spin-offs, and then a remake, most recently in 2023. Dead Space is honestly one of my favorite games of all time. The impactful beginning of crashing your ship into the SS Ishimura, and then slowly walking and discovering how the crew is completely gone. Then the first necromorph attacks, and as you run away hopelessly, you quickly make it to a safe room, where there you find the plasma cutter. Now you know you're in it for real. Dead Space takes place in space. Duh. You play as an engineer called Isaac Clarke, who is sent to investigate a distress signal sent by the SS Ishimura, and quickly discover that the entire ship has been overrun by alien parasites that reanimate corpses and use vents like there were aliens hunting you down and they were sus. And you know what? I'll keep saying it. Dead by Daylight needs more indoor maps. The Nostromo wreckage should have been a completely indoor map. Behavior, you cowards! Even though I placed this very high on my list, I'm pretty sure that Behavior might actually struggle to implement Isaac as a survivor, considering he rarely shows his face. I feel like the way they would do it is that they would have a removable helmet that is only on for chases, and every other interaction, like healing or on the hook, his helmet would retract back like Iron Man. They could also sell a bunch of more skins that way, because you know it's all about the money, money, money. So for a survivor, we would have Isaac Clarke, my darling, the classic SS Ishimura as the map, as a fully indoor map. And for the main killer, we would honestly pick from any of the necromorphs. There are such a big variety. I think the Regenerator might be one of the best picks. He is deadly and encapsulates what a necromorph really is. Just imagine, you kill off a survivor and then they come back as a necromorph. Just a couple of Nemesis zombie necromorphs walking around. Dead Space is filled with just so much possibility for a Dead by Daylight chapter, and it is a shame they haven't done anything with it yet. Number 3, Until Dawn. For this spot, I was actually very undecisive. I couldn't decide between Until Dawn or The Quarry, but ultimately, I went with the original classic Until Dawn, released back in 2015 by Supermassive Games, which are also making the casting of Frank Stone, which is based on Dead by Daylight. So I think out of all of these, Until Dawn might be the highest on the possibility list. Until Dawn is a choose-your-own-path style game where it feels like more of an interactive movie than it does a game. Your choices shape the outcome of these main survivors. The game stars a colorful cast of characters that after a tragic event, they get back together to reconcile over the events, only to be met with an extreme weather condition, horrible monsters, and psycho mountain men hunting them down. And not soon after, the real antagonist presents itself as the Wendigos. For Dead by Daylight chapter, I feel like it can do a double protagonist scenario, with the likes of Sam and Mike being the 2 main characters, of course. They could give us the Lodge, similar situation to Mount Ormond, maybe a neighboring lodge, maybe a little bit higher up the mountain. And for the killer, you gotta go with the Wendigo. And don't give me that stuff that the hag is already a Wendigo. We have 2 hillbillies, 3 guys in masks, and 2 clowns. We can have another Wendigo. With its quick, almost stop motion like movement, it's hyper stylized, and a very deadly force. An Until Dawn movie is also being made with no release date yet, but I feel like it could highly influence the chances of landing in Dead by Daylight in the near future. Number 2. The Evil Within. Released all the way back in 2014, The Evil Within is a third-person survival horror action game that really wanted to cement its roots back into the original survival horror genre. Every game was being an Outlast, every game was being an Amnesia, with wanting to strip the player of any ways of defending themselves. The Evil Within stars Sebastian Castellanos, a detective investigating a mass murder site where he and his team are quickly knocked out and kidnapped and placed in a deadly scenario where they have to fight to survive against waves of insane monsters, demons, psychopaths in order to survive. Just like in Resident Evil. I'm sorry, I keep comparing every game to Resident Evil. I feel like this chapter could be a double survivor with Sebastian and Julie. Julie being the second main character, also starring in the DLC. As for our map, there are so many places to choose from. There's the abandoned town, there's the insane asylum, and there's the creepy old abandoned not Resident Evil 1 mansion. As for the killer, there are also a couple of options we can go with. There's Laura, who is a very deadly threat that will one-shot kill you no matter how many tries you do, and I can't get past this part. There's also the kinda sexy in a weird way lamp lady, or the crazy sadists that appear in most other sections of the game holding a chainsaw. A gigantic bulking man with a geometrical shape for a head covered in barbed wire, and wait a minute, have I seen this before? This hulking monstrosity chases you around and makes your life a living hell. With as crazy and practically batshit insane as all of this sounds, I feel like it would open such a big gateway into creative powers and abilities for this killer. It's such a shame that The Evil Within is such an underrated game. I really hope this game gets a little bit more attention in the future, and hopefully, a third installment. Number 1. BioShock. The underwater utopia turned dystopian nightmare, Rapture. The center of a magnificently horrifying tale known as BioShock. BioShock is my number 1 on the list as I feel it would be a perfect addition to Dead by Daylight. Released all the way back in the distant year of 2007, BioShock is a first-person shooter, narratively driven and artistically designed on what will culminate in one of the most culturally important games of the generation. BioShock redefined what storytelling as a horror video game could be, with a multitude of games trying to recreate its charm to this very day. The story of BioShock starts in the 1960s over the mid-Atlantic. You crash land in the ocean and find a mysterious lighthouse. Once inside, you find a bathysphere that takes you to the underwater city of Rapture. A city designed not to be led by any one world government or religious ideologies, but just the full creativity and capabilities of man. Of course, letting people do what they want would always lead to chaos. Eventually discovering a new type of drug converted into an injectable that gave you supernatural powers would plunge the city into a fight for survival. When you first arrive into Rapture, the first thing you will notice is how beautiful and breathtaking the atmosphere is. The perfectly crafted Art Deco mixed with the underwater aquarium feel makes it so unique in its style. I will never stop saying it. Dead by Daylight needs more indoor maps. And what a better way than to introduce Rapture as one of those maps. BioShock is rich in its environmental design, that they could choose from a plethora of areas from the game. But why stop at the ocean, when we can also look to the skies, to the floating city of Columbia? BioShock Infinite is the third installment in the franchise that takes the player into a different city altogether. The city of Columbia is designed with an old American colonialism aesthetic that lets its greed and hubris shine through, that ultimately led to its downfall. Any one of those 2 maps would be a great addition to Dead by Daylight. Personally, I would go for Rapture, which is the most iconic. Or they could also go for a blend of the 2. But we can't talk about BioShock without the big man himself, the Big Daddy. They are also the face of the game. These big metallic monstrosities are a type of mini-boss that you would encounter throughout the entire game, mostly seen protecting a little girl known as the Little Sister, that you can then defeat the Big Daddy and either save or harvest the Little Sister. Even though that if you choose harvest, you are a monster and the worst type of person. The Big Daddy is as strong as he does look fierce, boasting a large arsenal of weapons, with his drill being the most iconic one. And don't let his size fool ya. Big Daddies are fast, very quickly dashing and closing the gap between you and him in an instant. BioShock has a plethora of really good and enticing enemies, including the Big Sister and the Songbird from Infinite. But what a better way to represent this amazing game than by its original mascot. Switching things to survivors, I think they should be Booker DeWitt and Elizabeth from BioShock Infinite. Yes, I know the first game does have a protagonist, Jack, but he is mostly a faceless and voiceless protagonist. There's also Subject Delta from the sequel, but having a Big Daddy as a survivor might be a little bit weird. So what better way than to go the Silent Hill route and have the two main characters from the third game portray the survivors in Dead by Daylight. And there you have it. Those are my top 10 picks for video game chapters I believe should be in Dead by Daylight. Let me know in the comments if I miss any of your favorite horror games. I also want to thank you for stopping by and watching this video. I post a lot of Dead by Daylight content on this channel. I would appreciate if you would like this video and or subscribe. It would really mean a lot to me and would help out this channel a lot. So, as always, thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you all laters.